Charishtotar Shatistvangre Sabhacharanda Bhaktivedanta Swami Srila Prabhupada Ki Jai Grantaraj Srimapaktam Ki Jai Anantakoti Vaishnavrinda Ki Jai Nitya Gaura Premanandi Hari Hari Prabhu. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Hare Krishna, today we are reading Srimad Bhagavatam, Canto 3, Chapter 10, Divisions of the Creation, text 16 and 17. Bhuta sargas tritiyastu. Bhuta sargas tritiyastu. Tanmatro dravya shaktiman. Tanmatro dravya shaktiman. Chaturta indriya sarga. Chaturta indriya sarga. Yastu jnana kriyatmaka. Yastu jnana kriyatmaka. Bhuta sargas tritiyastu. Tanmatro dravya shaktiman. Chaturta indriya sarga. Yastu jnana kriyatmaka. Bhuta sargas tritiyastu. Tanmatro dravya shaktiman. Chaturta indriya sarga. Yastu jnana kriyatmaka. Tiyastu Tanmatro dravya shaktiman. Chaturta indriya sarga. Yastu jnana kriyatmaka. Bhuta sargas tritiyastu. Tanmatro dravya shaktiman. Chaturta indriya sarga. Yastu jnana kriyatmaka. Bhuta sargas tritiyastu. Tanmatro dravya shaktiman. Chaturta indriya sarga. Yastu jnana kriyatmaka. Shri Radha Gopinath Bhagavan Ki Jai. Anyone else? Word to word, Bhuta Sarga, creation of matter. Tritiyaha is the third. Two, but Tatmatraha, sense perception. Dravya, of the elements. Shaktiman, generator. Chaturtaha, the fourth. Indriyaha, in the matter of the senses. Sargaha, creation. Yaha, that which. Two, but. Jnana, knowledge acquiring. Kriya, working. Atmakaha, basically. Translation by Divine Grace Bhacharanda Bhaktivedanta Swami Srila Prabhupada Ki Jai. The sense perceptions are created in the third creation, and from these the elements are generated. The fourth creation is the creation of knowledge and of working capacity. So, text 17. Mekariko divasarga panchamo yanmayanmano shashtastutamasa sargo yastu buddhikrita prabhu. Translation and purport. Prabhupada. The fifth creation is that of the controlling deities by the interaction of the mode of goodness, of which the mind is the sum total. The sixth creation is the ignorant darkness of the living entity by which the master acts as a fool. Purport. The demigods in the higher planets are called devas because they are all devotees of Lord Vishnu. Vishnu Bhakta Smitu Daiva Asuras Tad Vipariyaya. All the devotees of Lord Vishnu are devas or demigods, whereas all others are asuras. That is the division of the devas and the asuras. Devas are situated in the mode of goodness of material nature, whereas the asuras are situated in the modes of passion or ignorance. The demigods or controlling deities are entrusted with departmental management of all the different functions of the material world. For example, one of our sense organs, the eye, is controlled by light. Light is distributed by the sun rays, and their controlling deity is the sun. Similarly, mind is controlled by the moon. All other senses, both for working and for acquiring knowledge, are controlled by the different demigods. The demigods are assistants of the Lord in the management of material affairs. After the creation of the demigods, all entities are covered by the darkness of ignorance. Each and every living being in the material world is conditioned by his mentality of lording it over the resources of material nature. Although a living entity is the master of the material world, he is conditioned by ignorance, by the false impression of being the proprietor of material things. The energy of the Lord called avidya is the bewildering factor of the conditioned souls. The material nature is called avidya or ignorance, but to the devotees of the Lord engaged in pure devotional service, this energy becomes vidya or pure knowledge. This is confirmed in Bhagavad Gita. The energy of the Lord transforms from Mahamaya to Yogamaya and appears to pure devotees in her real feature. The material nature therefore appears to function in three phases, as the creative principle of the material world, as ignorance, and as knowledge. As disclosed in the previous verse, in the fourth creation the power of knowledge is also created. The conditioned souls are not originally fools, but by the influence of the avidya function of material nature they are made fools, and thus they are unable to utilize knowledge in the proper channel. By the influence of darkness the conditioned soul forgets his relationship with the Supreme Lord, and is overwhelmed by attachment, hatred, pride, ignorance, and false identification, the five kinds of illusion that cause material bondage. Magyanatim randasya gyananjana shalakya chakshuttam militam yena tasma shri gurve namaha Shri Chaitanya manobhishtam stapitam yena bhutale svayam rupa gadamaryam dadate svaparantikam Vandeham Shri Guru Shri Ataparikamlam Shri Gurun Vaishnavamshta Shri Rupam Sakrachatam Sahagana Raghunatan Vitam Tam Sachivam Sadvetam Savadutam Parichana Saitam Krishna Chaitanya Devam Shri Radha Krishna Padan Sahagana Lalita Shri Vishakhan Vitamshta He Krishna Karuna Sindhu Dina Bandha Jagatpate Gopesha Gopika Kanta Radha Kanta Namostate Tapta Kanchana Gaurange Radhe Vrindavaneshwari Vrishabhanasate Devi Pranamami Hare Priya Vancha Kalpatarubhyascha Kripa Sindhu Bhevacha Patitanam Pavanebhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namaha Jai Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadara Srivasari Gaura Bhakta Vrinda Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, thank you for coming. Srimad Bhagavatam class. So we're discussing the 10th chapter of the 3rd canto called Divisions of the Creation, in which we heard in the beginning of the chapter Vidura asking several questions about the creation, obviously, and Maitreya Rishi is responding. And so in the last verses, he was talking about different forms of dissolution, and that was in text 14. And now then yesterday in text 15, he started off describing the different forms of creations, which he's stating here that there are 9. And he explained that the first is creation of Mahatattva. As we know, that's where we see in the picture, where is it now? Is it there? Of Mahavishnu lying down in this cloud of the Mahatattva. Like it's explained, the whole existence is pervaded by the Lord's personal effulgence of his body, the Brahmajyoti, but for the one part, 1/4 is covered by the cloud of the material energy, which originally is pradhan, or then transforms into Mahatattva. So, and yeah, that's where Lord Mahavishnu is lying down and breathes out the universes, as we know, and then enters as Garbhodakashaya Vishnu and Kshirodakashaya Vishnu. And so the first creation is that of Mahatattva, we heard yesterday, and then the second creation is that of the false ego, and we, yeah, in other parts of Bhagavatam, I believe later in the 3rd canto, and even I think already in the 2nd canto we heard it's described in more detail how then exactly, as like one topic we heard in this chapter already also was about Kala, about time. So, and there we hear then that how all those steps of the different creations of hearing here a few verses in brief, describing them, how in detail it works with the Lord, using his impersonal features in the form of time and interacting or activating then always together with the false ego, and then the different steps of going to more and more gross manifestations in this cosmic manifestation. So, which starts off with here in the second creation with false ego. So that's what yesterday Nityananda Prabhu was talking about, false ego. And now in today's verses 16 and 17 we are here then in the third creation, is when the sense perception are created, and then from these the elements, and which is interesting also because we might think with our gross material understanding that we grew up with, that the elements that must come first, and sense perceptions we can't really relate to it so much. We think, well, that's there also, but we hear here that actually and again we hear that in more details in other parts, how the elements are coming, they are more gross than the sense perceptions, so they come after the sense perceptions. And then the fourth creation we hear here is that the creation of knowledge and of working capacity. Fifth, of the controlling deities by the interaction of the mode of goodness. So that's also interesting that we hear then later, and I think from the next chapter onwards, of then Lord Brahma's creation, the Visarga, the secondary creation, how he actually creates all living entities, including the demigods. But then here we hear that there is the controlling deities who already exist before, controlling deities of of the senses, as we hear Prabhupada is explaining in the purport today as well. So they are already there at that stage, and actually I think we heard that in the second canto or in the earlier here, that at one point actually all of them they pray to the Lord, and that's when we hear then of the Vishwarup and everything, how that they like Ganeshan Prabhu was nicely explaining that actually one function of the Lord's universal form is to show to all those devatas how they are supposed to play their role further in the creation. That's why he displays the universal form to them. At that point, when they are bewildered, not knowing what to do, then they offer prayers to the Lord, and then he shows the universal form, showing how everything should be situated in the cosmos and how it should function. And so then they play their part accordingly. And then sixth creation we hear is the ignorant darkness of the living entity by which the master acts as a fool. And in the end of the purport, Prabhupada pointed out those layers of ignorance by which the living entity is covered, and which also we discussed that Lord Brahma, for him, the first part he has to do is also to create those different coverings of the living entities to be able to actually fulfill their desires in their material pursuits by forgetting completely the relationship with the Lord and identifying with matter accordingly. So, and in the first part of the purport, Srila Prabhupada is focusing on the devatas, because we hear here specifically about those who are in control of the senses, and so Prabhupada is giving the example of the eye, that it depends on light, and light comes from the sun, and we know there's Vivasvan, the sun god, who is controlling the sun, and so ultimately our sense of sight is dependent on the sun god. And similarly, the other example he mentions is the mind, that the mind itself, which is the leader of all the other senses, so in the sixth sense, the mind is controlled by the moon god, by the moon, and thus by the moon god, by Soma, or Chandra. And so in terms of the demigods, I wanted to speak a few words in regard, like in my last class I discussed a bit about, because it was at just after we had Govardhan Puja, so I was speaking a bit about Indra's pride, how it was crushed by Krishna through this beautiful pastime of him lifting Govardhan hill and making null and void all of Indra's attempt to destroy all of Vrindavan and its inhabitants by sending those mighty clouds, the clouds which are meant for devastation, the Samvartaka clouds. And so how his pride got crushed, and I also shared a few words from a lecture of my Guru Maharaj, Sulnest Simrita Swami Maharaj, about how he was explaining from the Acharyas that Indra, even in that pastime, even all after that, when he went then upon the advice of, like, after he had realized his mistake, and then after 7 days of trying like that, then he went to Lord Brahma, his superior, and obviously begged for help. And Lord Brahma told him, well, I myself, I can't do anything, also you go to Surabhi, to the ancestor of the cows, on this material planet, within the material universe, Goloka. Shri Radha Gopinath. Okay, Cha. So that then he took Surabhi cow to the base of Govardhan, where Krishna was mercifully awaiting Indra to pardon him, accepting his prayers and all of that, and Abhishek then from Indra and from Surabhi through his elephant carrier Airavata and so forth. And so I made the point repeating that even after all of that, still Indra, his false ego was not completely removed. He was, which was shown even by his prayers, how he offered them. He did it in a very smart way, but in a way of like a little naughty child, just whose only consideration is of not wanting to be punished, and rather than actually being ready to accept fully the mistake and to change, and not to in that way make sure never to make the mistake again and become a better devotee. So, and because that was shown by him, obviously again then later doing the same mistake in the past, for example, with where Krishna for Satyabhama, one of his queens, steals the Parichata tree, or not really steals, he is the supreme proprietor. So and even when he goes up and returns the umbrella of Varuna, the earrings of Aditi, and the mountain peak of Sumera mountain, or which one, or Mandara mountain, to the demigods upon the request of Indra, and then just he takes one Parichata tree, and then Indra gets furious and fights against Krishna. So that shows that he didn't learn his lesson, and that he actually his false ego was not removed, but rather it was just, he was humiliated, but he was simply out of shame. He was apparently very humble, but he was not really genuinely humble, because if you're really humble, then you fully take the mistake to heart and change and at least sincerely want to change, but he didn't. But having said that, all of that is not to look down on Indra from our side, to criticize him, but it's for us to learn lessons. And I heard recently from His Grace Amarendra Prabhu, and he gave actually, I think, five lectures on the glories of Giriraj Govardhan. And so there he mentioned also about this with Indra, that we should always remember that he's very exalted. He was quoting one Purana, I think, where, for example, even all the glorifications offered to Lord Shiva also offered to Lord Indra, and so he's very exalted. I was thinking, even like from the simple point of, with all those main demigods, we can understand like why would Krishna give them such a high responsibility of entrusting to them, like in the case of Indra, entrusting to him rain, sending rain everywhere in the universe, or like the sun god, for example, obviously, managing the sun, on which all the other planets, all the other living entities are dependent on for survival, and same as with Varuna, with Vayu, and all the major demigods. So they must be very exalted, otherwise Krishna would not trust them and thus entrust to them such important services. And also in terms of these major functions, like I find it quite funny, like how Prabhupada is saying that. I remember I believe perhaps in the third chapter and the second chapter of Bhagavad Gita, in one Prabhupada is saying like that it in such a way that it's like first of all, most of us, especially from Western background, we are not at all aware of that there are demigods and who are controlling all those functions of nature, but Prabhupada is putting it in such a natural way that it's a given. Like he's saying in one purpose, like that the watering, heating, and lightning of the universe we have to remember that it's all done by those demigods, and that which are all the essential functions for being able to live in this universe, and therefore, we're completely dependent on their service, which of course ultimately Krishna is in control. He's entrusting it to them, and if they would screw up, he would make up for it. But still, so it's good to remember also, like to learn those basic things about our material life, how we are dependent on higher beings, and ultimately, of course, everything being done by Krishna. Like Prabhupada is explaining here that the demigods are entrusted with departmental management of all the different functions of the material world. So, Krishna, of course, he's all competent, all powerful, he can do everything by himself, but he likes always to give credit to his devotees and to entrust services to them. And so similarly with the demigods, he is doing that. And I was recently reading the 15th chapter, which we spent, like I think last year we had Purushottam month, where we devotees especially read this chapter. And it's a very beautiful chapter. It's very brief actually. I think it has only like 20 verses or something like that. But there's several verses, one series where Krishna is explaining about also how we are dependent on him even in our material life. And because in the beginning of the chapter he is giving the example of, or the analogy of the banyan tree being reflected on the water, as being the material world being the perverted reflection of the spiritual world. So, and he's explaining that we have to become, real knowledge means to understand that and to become detached from that. So the first verse is Urdhva Moolam Adahashak Ashvatam Prahu Avyayam Chandamsmi Yasya Parnani Yastam Vedasa Vedavit. So that Urdhva Moolam means the root is upwards, and Adahashakam means the branches are downwards. So in other words, it's like a reflected tree. upside down, and Ashvatam Pravargayam, so this banyan tree, and Chandamsini Yasya Parnani, so the leaves are the Vedas, and then the last line, Yastam Vedasa Vedavid. So one who knows that is the real knower of the Vedas. And because if you really know that, then you will understand that I have to get out of that. That's not the real tree, not the real world in which I should be situated in. And so therefore he explains then through knowledge you should cut off this attachment and should seek out your real origin, which is Krishna, and surrender to him. But to be able to surrender, there's one important thing is to understand how we are dependent on Krishna and how he is all competent to take care of us. So that's why then later in those verses he is nicely explaining how he's taking care of us. First he's explaining on the cosmic level that he's giving the sun the power of illumination and heat, as well as with fire, as well as with the moon. And it is him who gives the moon the power to nourish all the plants to become succulent, rasatmaka, to get rasa, because with the sun alone, which is explained there that the plants can grow, but they can't really become succulent. They can't really properly nourish. And also he's pointing out there that it is Krishna who is holding up all the planets in the universe. And then at the more personal level, Krishna is explaining how he is not only so in the cosmic level, we understand that it is Krishna who is providing to us all our material necessities. Ultimately Krishna, of course, through the demigods, as we hear here today. But then also at the more personal level, it is Krishna who then enables us to digest the food, as Krishna is saying, I'm the digestive fire, the Vaishvanara. And also then, even more subtle, then in the famous verse 15:15, he's explaining that he's also, as the super soul, he's the one who is initiating all our activities and who is giving us knowledge, remembrance and forgetfulness. And he's the one who is to be known by the Vedas, the goal of the Vedas. And also he, as Srila Vyasadeva, is the one who compiled the Vedas. So he's giving us this knowledge to be able to understand ourselves and understand the Lord and to get out of the material world. And so understanding our dependence on many levels by Krishna, by His grace Himself giving us, for example, here in the Bhagavad Gita, this knowledge, helps us then to, really understand, yes, on every level I'm dependent on the Lord, so the only thing I should do is to surrender to Him. Actually, Prabhupada in those purports in the 15th chapter, like you'll see so many times, it's just this theme of, yes, you should surrender to Krishna, and so beautifully Prabhupada is writing that, and very penetrating. So, it's a really beautiful chapter. And it's a brief chapter, so I'll just talk a few more words on that, on the general flow of content. So in the first 5 verses, Krishna is explaining this banyan tree of the perverted material world and the perverted reflection, and then that you should surrender, and then in the 6th verse he is explaining that how the spiritual world is like, that yet natad pasayate suryo nashashankuna pavakaha yat katva nani vartante tatam paramamama, that at that place there is no need of illumination of the sun and of the moon or of fire, as we were just discussing, as it is very much needed in the material world, how we are dependent there. And having gone there to his supreme abode, one never returns. And so then in the 7th verse is also very famous, where we then understand why is it like that? Because we are his part and parcel. We are Mama Evamsho, Jivaloka, Jivabhuta Sanatana. We are his eternal parts and parcels. But having come to the material world, we are struggling. We are Manashashtanindriyani Praktistani Karshati. We are constantly struggling. And this Karshati, and Prabhupada explains there that Karshati means it's not just struggling, means struggling while in this body, and also includes being forced to leave the body and to enter another body, so birth and death, all of that. And so that's why Krishna explains that then briefly, this transmigration of the soul, driven by the mind, by our conditioning, in which he gives the analogy of the air carrying aroma. So in the similar way, Krishna is saying we carry our conceptions of our material life, our material desires, from one body to the next. And in fact, that's the very thing which we know, as we know, which determines then what kind of body we get in the next life. Our karma and our inclinations and our desires. And then he also explains how there's some how you cannot even understand all of that in which how you are situated in this body, and how you are forced to transmigrate if you're simply absorbed in this material energy, that only those who strive sincerely for self-realization and hear submissively that they can understand. And then 12 to 15 is what we just discussed about, where he's explaining how he's our maintainer. And then he concludes in the last section. First he gives 3 verses, 16 to 18 of, it's called the Sri Shloka Gita of Knowledge, a summary of the Vedas and the Vedanta. So because in 15, in the famous verse, Sarvasya Mridasana Vishnu, he's saying that Vedashta Sarve Aham Eva Vedyo, that I'm to be known by all the Vedas. And so then he gives a brief summary, therefore, of the Vedas, where he explains there's the fallible and infallible living entities, and that fallible are the ones like us, obviously, who fell into the material energy, being because of our, as Prabhupada concludes then in the last purport of the 15th chapter, that there's 2 weaknesses of the heart. The first is the desire to wanting to lord over material nature, so to enjoy independently of Krishna. And the second is then to, as we more and more desire that, and irrespective of our failures, always try for sense gratification, then we become more and more attached to matter. So that's the second weakness of the heart, and it is because of that we are fallible. And Krishna explains, but he as the super soul, he's transcendental to both of them, and then as the Bhagavan feature, he's celebrated in the Vedas and in the world. So that's why that he as Krishna, as Bhagavan, is ultimately the supreme object of worship. And then in the last 2 verses, he's concluding that one who understands this is actually the real knower. It's a beautiful, simple verse. I try to remember, just stated, saying, Yomam evam samudo chinati purushottamam sa sarvavit bhajati mam sarvabhavena bharata. Where Krishna is explaining that, so one asamudo without any doubt, not being befooled by material energy, one who understands me in this way, as he has just explained himself in the 15th chapter to Arjuna, that such a person, he's sarvavit. He actually knows, he's the knower of everything, because everything comes from Krishna. So if you understand Krishna, then you understand the essence of everything. And understanding the essence, then you bhajati mam sarva bhavena. Then you engage yourself in worshipping me, in my devotional service. And how? Sarva bhavena. You give all your bhav, all your emotions, simply to try to please Krishna. Or Prabhupada in the word to word is saying sarva bhavena is in all respects. So it's a bit more practical level to translate that, showing that giving our full heart has to be, especially for us sadhakas, not in a speculative way that I give all my heart, but I do it in whatever way I like, but in all respects. And for example, we worship Shri Radha Gopinath according to the rules and regulations, performing that many artis, that many offerings with all the different articles, and we do all of, so we follow the Shastras, we follow the Acharyas, Srila Prabhupada, giving us the morning program, giving us the different services needed in the temple, and of course, and always he stressed, especially book distribution and outreach to share this knowledge. So that's how Sarva Bhavina in all respects, how we can serve Krishna. And in that way, understand everything and live the full conclusion of the Vedas. So that was briefly on the 15th chapter, which is Purushottam Yoga. And now to come back to today's purport, where after explaining about the demigods, Prabhupada is saying that after the creation of the demigods, all entities are covered by the darkness of ignorance. And so I'll skip one sentence. He's saying then that although a living entity is the master of the material world, he is conditioned by ignorance, by the false impression of being the proprietor of material things. So, and this false impression of being the proprietor of everything, he very beautifully actually also condemns or explains also in the 15th chapter, which I just discussed in this last of those first five verses of where he explains about anatta nivritti, about the detachment from the material world, and before then from 6th verse till 20th, I think that's the last one. Then in Purushottam Yoga about atta pravritti, that therefore we should give ourselves to Krishna. So in this last verse, in the 5th verse, Nirmana, which is a very beautiful verse also, Nirmana moha chitta sanga dosha atyatmanitya vinivritikamaha tetvan vimukta sukha dukkha samniyar gachanti mudha katam padamavyayam tat. So Nirmana moha, there Krishna says what is needed to be able to become really detached, to be able to surrender to Krishna. That first of all you have to be free from false prestige. And that's the main theme that Prabhupada is talking on in that purport. I'll quickly read it because it's really beautiful and powerful. So Prabhupada is saying the surrendering process is described here very nicely. The first qualification is that one should not be deluded by pride. Because the conditioned soul is puffed up, thinking himself the lord of material nature, it is very difficult for him to surrender unto the Supreme Personality of Godhead. One should know by the cultivation of real knowledge, so that's now Adhyatma Nityaha from the verse, that he is not lord of material nature, the Supreme Personality of Godhead. The Supreme Personality of Godhead is the Lord. When one is free from delusion caused by pride, he can begin the process of surrender. For one who is always expecting some honor in this material world, it is not possible to surrender to the Supreme Person. Pride is due to illusion, for although one comes here, stays for a brief time, and then goes away, he has the foolish notion that he is the Lord of the world. It thus makes all things complicated, and he is always in trouble. The whole world moves under this impression. People are considering the land, this earth, to belong to human society, and they have divided the land under the false impression that they are the proprietors. One has to get out of this false notion that human society is the proprietor of this world. When one is freed from such a false notion, he becomes free from all the false associations caused by familiar, social and national affections. So that's now Chitta Sangha Dosha, being freed from false association. These faulty associations bind one to this material world. After this stage, one has to develop spiritual knowledge. One has to cultivate knowledge of what is actually his own and what is actually not his own. And when one has an understanding of things as they are, he becomes free from all dual conceptions, such as happiness and distress, pleasure and pain. So that's Tvan Vimukta Sukha Dukkha Samnya. He becomes full in knowledge, then it is possible for him to surrender to the Supreme Personality of Godhead. So, it's because it's amazing, this ignorance so prevalent nowadays, how we are completely forgetful of how the Lord is the proprietor of everything. And we see that to such an extent, like Prabhupada is discussing here, that we divide the whole earth, the land, and very vehemently claim proprietorship over specific parts in being at a small level, like all of us, that we believe ourselves proprietors of a specific home or property, little land, or at the level of nations. And at that level we see even that nations even claim proprietorship of things which can't even be used by human society, like in the desert or in even in Antarctica, for example. So, and even the water is divided into proprietorship for different nations, and even the sky. So, yeah, that's the extent of how this illusion goes to. But we have always to understand always that how is it? Isvaresvara Ishvarash. No, that. First verse in Isvaresvara. Ishavasyam idam sarvam jagat. No, that's invocation. The first. Anyway. So I forgot now. But then, yeah, the first verse in Isvaresvara, of course, and it's an 8th canto as well, because it was there. Manu is praying, Swayambhu Manu, and he's the one who I heard from Chaitanya Charan Prabhu, but he's the one actually speaking the Isvaresvara, praying in that way to the Lord, to Yakya Avatar. So, yeah, we understand that the Lord is the proprietor of everything, and He divided Tena Tak Tena Punjita in it, or He provides it to us and allocates it to us in a specific quota, and we should be satisfied with that and not fight over things, like Prabhupada so many times would say. That's like the business of cats and dogs, which nowadays people are doing, even at the national level, fighting over material things. And yeah, and in terms of this pride of, I wanted to mention also, my Guru Maharaj, I heard that recently, he was quoting Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur as saying that ultimately pride means actually that he's saying I'm proud because I believe that I can be happy by gratifying the senses of my material body. That I don't need Krishna, I don't need anyone else. I don't need, and many people might even say, yeah, I don't need much. I'm rather meek and humble. I just need a little bit. But still, it comes, as long as we don't surrender to Krishna, it means that we're still proud of thinking ourselves independent and thinking that, yeah, I can be happy, I don't depend on Krishna. So that's more the root level, and that expands then obviously to the national level, as we just discussed. And so now coming to the last part of the purport, where Prabhupada is discussing between Vidya and Avidya, and he's then explaining that in terms of Mahamaya and Yogamaya, that understanding that it is the same energy originally, it's Yogamaya, it's Krishna's internal potency, but for our sake of enabling our material life, he, as a partial representation, then Yogamaya acts as Mahamaya, of putting us into this illusion of thinking ourselves independent. And Prabhupada is explaining there that for devotees, then the same energy again very easily can act as Yogamaya, as his internal potency, originally coming from Srimati Radharani. And yeah, and we know, so even in Bhagavad Gita itself, actually, like Prabhupada in today's purport, he mentioned that also, that Krishna is explaining that. So we hear that verses like where Krishna is telling about his energy as referring to his acting as material energy, and in other verses where he's acting as spiritual energy. So material energy, for example, in 7.14 of Davi Yesha Gunamayi Mama Maya Turataya, that this divine energy of mind, so he's also calling it divine, because Prabhupada is explaining that it's ultimately acting by his will, Mayatyaksena Prakriti Susayate Sacharacharam Hetunane Kontiyat Jagat Viparivartate. That's the verse from the 9th chapter, where Krishna explains that even material energy, it's acting under my supervision. So it's also divine, being ultimately under his control, but it is acting not in a way as it originally would, if we were in our proper consciousness, enabling our loving exchange with the Lord, as it does in Yogamaya, but it is keeping us away from the Lord, and we can't overcome it, as Krishna says there in 7.14, only if we surrender to him. Then Mama Ivaye Prapatente Mayam Itam Tarantite. Then we can easily cross beyond it. So that's in terms of the material energy, and then in other verses, like in 9.14, I think, the Mahatmanas Tamamparta Daivim Prakritim Ashrita, where he's saying the Mahatmas, the great souls, are those who have completely taken shelter of my internal potency, of Srimati Radharani. And having taken shelter in that way, then, how's the third line? But Jantiananya Manaso, is that correct? Yeah, that they engage themselves fully in my devotional service with all their heart and understanding me to be the Supreme Lord, original and inexhaustible. So, yeah, and so as long as we are, as Ganesh Prabhu was recently discussing Uddhavad Gita, I think just yesterday, how as long as we are acting under material energy, thinking with this pride of, I can be happy by gratifying my senses, then we are actually simply slaves of Maya, as we know. Krishna says in like Prakriti Kriyamani Gunai Karamani Sarvashaha Ahankara Vimodatma Kartami Timanyate, that if we are deluded by false ego, we think ourselves the doers, but actually it's carried out by the material energy, by the free modes. And so, on the other hand, those who understand their position and surrender to the Lord, those are the actual real masters. Like Prabhupada today, he was saying that, we are, to some extent, we are masters of the material energy. Krishna is giving us some control, he's giving us this play field, but ultimately we are not in full control. We are much, as long as we're sitting in material energy, as mostly it's done everything by the modes and not by ourselves actually. Whereas real masters, real Goswamis are those who, real Swamis are Goswamis, those who control their senses. And that's what yesterday we heard in Uddhava Gita. While we are slaves of Maya, that's why, because we forget our eternal relationship with the Lord. And like Ganesh Prabhu was giving the example of, and that's because that's our eternal duty. He was saying, like, when we are, even in one lifetime, we have some duties which are for a short time, like one as a student for a few years, or we have one job for a few years and then we change it. Whereas other duties are for the whole life, like as mother, father, or with friends we might have for the whole life, and so forth. But our eternal duty beyond this life is our relationship with Shri Shri Radha Gopinath. But in material energy we are completely forgetful of that. So that's why we heard recently in Chaitanya Charitamrita how Mahaprabhu is instructing Srila Sanatana Goswami, after his posing himself very humbly as being such a conditioned soul, not knowing who he is and what his duty is, that Mahaprabhu is explaining then about Sambandha, Abhideya and Prayojana. That first it starts with Sambandha, that again we have to understand our relationship with the Lord, with Krishna, and then accordingly engage in devotional service in the process, Abhideya, and ultimately therefore reach the ultimate goal of love of Godhead. And that's why Krishnadas Kaviraj Goswami, he's saying there's only, for a devotee, there's only three things which are really meaningful, which are the real wealth. And that is Krishna, because he's referring to this three, Sambandha, Abhideya and Prayojana, because Krishna is the person whom we are eternally related to in our loving relationship, so our Sambandha. Abhideya is, so second is devotional service to the Lord, because that is our eternal activity, our eternal process to engage in. And third, the goal, Prayojana, is love, ecstatic love for Krishna. So only those three things are really ultimately meaningful, and everything else in our life is simply to assist us to fully realize that and fully live that. So I'll conclude here if there's any comments or questions. Grantara Chimapaktam Ki Cha, Srila Prabhupada Ki Cha.